Did you know that there was a naval version of the Spitfire? Well, today we're going to be taking a look at 5 facts about this legendary fighter aircraft that you may not already know. So stay tuned. Fact number 1. The first prototype of the Spitfire flew on July 1934, so over a year before the start of the Second World War. In fact, it wasn't until after the prototype had been built and tested that the Air Ministry even placed an order for production models. In fact, the very first batch of 30 production Spitfires wasn't even completed until February 1936. That was more than a year after the first prototype had flown, and just a few months prior to the outbreak of the Second World War. And these early examples of the Spitfire were actually delivered to 19 Squadron at Kenley in June of 1936. These aircraft didn't even have the characteristic teardrop fuel tanks that most people associate with the Spitfire today. You see, during the building of the prototypes, the wings had been built using a stressed skin technique, where the skin of the wing was actually part of the structure. But when it came to building the production airframes, the stressed skin technique was deemed to be too difficult and expensive to manufacture. As such, the production Spitfires used a different method known as Thembangan technique. This is the same technique that was used on other contemporary aircraft such as the Hawker Fury and the Hurricane. Basically, with this technique, the wings were made up of a number of wooden spars and ribs covered over with fabric, and then the skin of the plane would be bolted over the top of this structure. Because of this change in construction method, the wings couldn't support the weight of the large teardrop tanks, so instead, they had to make do with these smaller rectangular tanks. However, it wasn't long before the production methods were improved, and the teardrop tanks could be fitted. Fact 2. Contrary to popular belief, the Merlin engine was not the original choice of engine for the Spitfire. In fact, when the prototype was built, it was originally powered by a 700 horsepower Rolls-Royce KV-4 petrol engine. Fact 3. After the Battle of France in 1940, many pilots reported that German fighters were disappearing into clouds without being intercepted by anti-aircraft fire. So it was decided that the next version of the Spitfire should be equipped with a powerful enough engine to allow it to operate effectively at much higher altitudes. This new model became known as the Spitfire 2A and was the first variant to feature the newly designed circular section fuselage, which allowed for better high-speed performance. The 2A also introduced a new 2-stage, 2-speed supercharger to increase the power output of the Merlin II engine. The first 2A Spitfires were delivered to the RAF in November of 1940. And 1 month later, 303 Squadron took delivery of 12 of these new 2A Spitfires, which would become known as the 303 Black Squad. A few weeks later, these aircraft began to intercept German bombers at much higher altitudes than any other previous interceptors. On January 1941, Polish pilot Sergeant Antoni Kwiatkowski became the first pilot to score a victory in the Spitfire 2A. Just 3 days later, Sergeant Kwiatkowski scored his second victory in the type. And by the end of the day, the 303rd Squadron had taken down 7 German aircraft. By the end of the Battle of Britain, the 303rd Squadron had destroyed or damaged more enemy aircraft than any other squadron, making them the most successful. In fact, had the 303rd Squadron been its own nation, they would have been the 6th most successful in the war. Fact 4. The Spitfire was the only British fighter throughout the entire Second World War that never received a major redesign, although it did receive numerous minor upgrades and improvements throughout its production life. This allowed the Spitfire to remain relevant for so long, simply because it was always keeping up with the times. This is in stark contrast to other British fighters such as the Hurricane and the Defiant, which both received major redesigns during the war. For example, the Hurricane Mark II was completely redesigned from the ground up and featured a completely new wing design and the installation of a more powerful engine, whereas the Spitfire remained essentially unchanged from the Mark I through to the Mark 24. And finally, fact number 5. Towards the end of the Second World War, the Admiralty put in an order for 300 Supermarine Spitfires to be converted for carrier operations. This version of the Spitfire would eventually become known as the Seafire. 150 of these Seafires were to be equipped with the latest radar and rockets and become night fighters, whilst the remaining 150 were to be used as a rocket-equipped attack aircraft, similar to the American Corsairs that were operating off the escort carriers in the Atlantic. This was in response to the threat posed by German U-boats, which had become a massive problem for the Allies in the Atlantic. The first Seafire scored a confirmed victory against a German U-boat on March 1945, and by the end of the war, Seafires had destroyed at least 12 U-boats. But although they were effective against surface vessels and U-boats, the Seafire proved to be unpopular with Fleet Air Arm pilots due to its poor handling characteristics on the carrier flight deck. In fact, the Seafire was so unpopular with Fleet Air Arm pilots that only 100 were ever completed, and this conversion program was abandoned shortly afterwards. But what did you think of the Seafire, and do you think the conversion program should have continued? Let me know in the comments below. So there you go. I hope you enjoyed this episode, with a special thanks to my supporters who helped make it possible. If you would like to find out more about the history of aviation, check out the rest of the content. And if you like what you saw, hit that subscribe button to join the 1000 plane crew. Thanks for watching.